Okay, so we're logged into our IBM system. This is my little corner of the cloud that I run up there in internet land. I connect through VPN to my server. I suggest you use your personal one if you're lucky to have one, or use your work one. Or if you're going to try and use a public service, you've got to have access to the web server setup. I don't believe things like Pub 400 let you do that, but I may be wrong. Or you can rent your own IBM IAM cloud, like I do. The going rate is around $200 a month. So just use your work machine if you've got access to it. Otherwise, we're going to create this SUPERSIMP piece of code. I pasted mine in using Visual Studio for Code. Here's the code itself, exactly the same as the code I've got in the article on the web. Here it is in glorious Visual Studio Code. I love the color coding. I hate the fact that I'm still coughing and spluttering. Please forgive me. I'll edit that out. All the standard stuff we've already gone through. I'm not going to go through it again. There's our simple piece of code. Let's look at this in good old-fashioned SEU. Here I am logged onto the machine in my terminal emulator. You'll probably call this green on black or black on green or whatever. I always change my color settings for black on white. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that. So don't ask yourself what's weird about it if you're a complete noob. The same piece of code in the good old-fashioned 1980s code editor called SEU. Same control option, same program interface, and if I page down, the same body and the same ending of the code. So all we need to do is compile this code. So let's compile it. I'm just going to go to command line so it makes it easier for you to see. Here's a command I prepared earlier. I typed this in. We're using all of the defaults on the create bound RPG command. We're just going to call it the program name. We're going to put it in my case, I'm putting in a library called nlitten. You're going to compile it into your library. Let's press it, enter, and see what happens. Creates the module, creates the bound program, glues it together. There's my RPG program. If I display the program, here's my compilation information, which you would of course be familiar with. If I press enter to go to the next screen, it shows me the size information. If I enter to the next screen, it shows me my module information. And finally, I'll see any service programs. I'm not using any. And then I have my copyright information after all the export stuff. Here's the copyright that I put into the RPG code. So you can see here, it's a useful way of tracking what versions of ILE code you are, because an ILE program might contain 1, 2, 5, 10, a dozen or more modules that make up that program. So when you look at two ILE bound programs, they might look the same across two libraries, but they might contain different modules, certainly different versions of the modules within those programs. And this is where using the copyright to show the version number of the module that's bound inside that ILE program is a useful technique of tracking things down. But I digress, and I'm getting excited talking about RPG programming, and I've got to stay focused on making a web service. Okay, so we have compiled our RPG program in our library. What's next? Well, I typed up this page here to talk about what we're going to do. Well, to give you some questions before we go on to our next step. So this is our super simple RPGLE program. It's going to return the success code and the message. We know that. We've placed it in our work library, your one of course, and we've compiled it. So what happens next? Well, a couple of things. We're going to create a web server. We're going to add the web service. That's the part of the web server that's going to call this new program that we've just written, and then we're going to test it. This makes a few questions pop into our brain. I'm going to assume you're a complete noob and you've never done any of this stuff, so don't be offended if I say really basic things. And I'm going to try and keep it at a relatively basic level without going really into the nitty-gritty, because we want someone just to be able to sit down and create a web service and see it happening. Once we get it running, we're going to enhance that and build on it. We're going to make that super simple web service a little more complicated. Then we're going to take that little more complicated one and make it into a glorious business-ready web service with all kinds of inputs and outputs and database reading, SQL, and whatever else exciting magic we want to add. But first of all, we've got to ask ourselves the basic questions, right? Before we create it, we've got to decide the protocol that we're going to be using on our web service. The old standard was SOAP, you might have heard of that, and the new standard is REST, you might have heard of that. I typed up some basic guff that tells you all about the differences between SOAP and REST. Read that, it's on the web page. However, the main difference, if you want to keep it really simple, is SOAP was the original protocol for talking to web services. It handled the basic connection between you and an HTTP server out there, or vice versa. It was the protocol, the language, if you like, that they spoke to each other, and it defined the data language that was being sent between those two machines, and that data language was XML. So what does XML look like? All of you are probably familiar with XML, but again, just to be basic, here's an example XML I just typed up. I've called a piece of XML my info, and within the XML I've got 3 values: name, surname, and email address. So I've said, here's an element called name. There's my name, and here's the end of that element. Here's one called surname. Don't know why that search engine suddenly burst into life. Here's an element called surname. There's my surname. There's the end of that element, and same for email. Straightforward, right? So that's what XML would look like over SOAP. When REST came out, REST was a streamlined communication technique that added lots of new functionality into it. HTTPS and some security elements, and it sliced out some of the old redundant code that was in SOAP. So REST is a faster, leaner communication technique with more facility built into it. So REST is kind of the preferred, by far the industry standard now for machines talking to each other. The huge benefit of REST, in my opinion, is that it handles XML just like SOAP does, but it also handles this new layout standard called JSON. Here's the same piece of code in JSON. Its elements, rather than being covered by a starter element name and then a slash end block element name, are using the weird little curly brackets. So it says, right, curly bracket, here's an element. Here's what it's called. Within this element, there's another pair of curly brackets that contain name, surname, and email. Pretty simple, pretty intuitive. You can see straight away it's just as readable, but it's much lighter. There's less characters. Much lighter, less characters, faster communication. You can do either. RPG can code and decode both. JSON is kind of the industry standard now, so I would lean towards, if you're going to be playing with it, be aware of how XML works, learn it, but JSON is what you should really be excuse me, focusing on going forward. So that leads us to the questions. How do we create a web server, and how do we test the web server? Creating the web server is easy. It's built into IBM i, so we're going to go through that next. How do we test it? That's also easy. There are several free testing tools. Oh man, I'm still coughing and spluttering. Excuse me. There's several free testing tools out there. My preferred two that I use are SOAP UI and Postman. I prefer Postman. Postman offers a bit more functionality, but I'm going to do the examples in SOAP UI purely because SOAP UI is open source, and that may be a restriction that you have at your shop. So we're going to play with the open source version. So next, let's go and create a web server. So come back in a minute and we'll dive right in.